Welcome to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're talking with a former law firm recruiter about the basics of OCI, or on-campus interviewing. Your Law School Toolbox host is Allison Monahan, and normally I'm with Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the Catapult Career Conference. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on iTunes. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started. Welcome back. Today we're talking with a former law firm recruiter about the basics of OCI, or on-campus interviewing. So welcome, Sadie. First off, give us a sense of your background. How is it that you know anything about OCI?
Well, I've been a recruiter and in professional development at a handful of law firms for the last 10 years. And I've organized our on-campus interviewing process at different firms and done the callback schedules and follow up with students and been on campus with them. So I have a variety of experience at all the different processes of OCI.
Awesome. So let's break it down a little bit. For people who aren't really familiar with this process, what's the point of OCI, and then how does it sort of work, basically?
Well, OCI is the way that most large law firms and even medium-sized law firms and some public interest jobs find their summer associates. And they interview them on campus first in short interviews, and then they call them back to the office if they're more interested to do a more in-depth interview. And then from there, they make offers to decide who their summer associate class is going to be.
Okay. And give me the really brief synopsis, particularly in BigLaw. What is a summer associate?
Well, it's basically a 6 to 10 week job interview to find your future lawyers. And it's really how most big law firms do the majority of their hiring.
Okay. And just so we're clear, our listeners are clear, these people actually get paid what the regular lawyers get paid, right?
They do. They get paid a first-year associate's salary for the amount of time that they're working at the law firm, obviously prorated for that amount of time.
Right, that's a pretty sweet deal. And they get like wined and dined. I mean, there is, certainly there's work involved, but it's a pretty sweet position.
It is. And I think something to keep in mind is that it's probably not a completely accurate view of what it will be like to be an associate at a law firm.
I think that's probably fair to say.
Yeah. You probably won't be working a lot of late nights, and all of your lunches definitely will be paid for, and a lot of your dinners and drinks, and you'll do different activities. But you do get real work experience, so it is a chance to see what it's like to be a junior associate.
Yeah, and like I was a summer, I think, at 3 different places, and some of them are better and worse experiences. I mean, one of my experiences definitely, I think, was exactly what it would have been like to work at that place, which was why you couldn't have paid me to get back there. But that's a whole different story.
Well, and I think it's a job interview in terms of the firm looking for you, but it's also a chance for you to see what it's going to be like in that culture at that place, and for you to decide, even if you get an offer at the end of the summer, whether or not you think you'd be happy there.
Yeah, and I think that's a key point to take away, and also to think about even as you're starting this process, because yes, firms are similar in a lot of ways. I mean, they're structured the same way, which has its own pressures typically, but they're not all the same. They have very different personalities, I think, and that's one of the things that I believe people should be looking for here is what type of firms do I want to be bidding on? Like, what are the characteristics of a place that I would like to work? What advice do you have for people about sort of figuring that out?
Well, I think there's a lot of ways to go about it. I've seen law students come up with like flashcards for every firm.
This is like after they've done the bids, or when they're trying to figure out who to bid on?
When they're trying to figure out what to bid for. And then also, I think once they get interviews and callbacks and things, and I think you can narrow it down. And I've seen spreadsheets and lots of complicated ways to decide. I think there are some key things to think about, which is location, size of firm, what are the hours requirements. Do you want to be at a big firm where you're going to have to work at least 2,000 billable hours a year? Maybe you want to work at a smaller firm where you're going to get paid less. Do you want to be at the main office of the law firm, or do you want to be at a big law firm but a smaller office? All of that affects, what your life will be like there. So I think those are all things to keep in mind. And then also just, what your grades are in law school and where you think is realistic for you to be able to work.
Yeah, I remember when I was doing the bidding process, it was just kind of this black box, and you're like, what am I even supposed to be looking at here? I think some schools, they pass out a lot more information about, I guess the process for bidding also varies by school. I went to Columbia, so you could basically at that time just sort of pick who you wanted to do an interview with, and they more or less had to talk to you. But I think a lot of schools, the firms are more involved in setting GPA cutoffs or deciding who they want to talk to. It's more kind of like the residency match in med school. Like both sides have to be willing to talk. And the schools may or may not give you information about like, this is the grade range they're looking for, or, they're looking for people who are on law review or whatever it is. I'm assuming that firms pretty much always have that stuff behind the scenes. Is that right?
I think that's correct. And I think for firms, it's the same thing. It sort of depends on the school and what information they're given. For a lot of the top schools, firms don't get to see students' grades before they interview them. And it's a lottery system. So the firms really have no control over who they're interviewing or whether people would meet the criteria that they want. There's other law schools where part of it's lottery and part of it law firms get to choose, and they get to actually see all the materials first. So I think some of it depends, but most of the time, the law firms only get the student's information less than a week ahead, and they just get a resume, and they don't really know what they're going into or who they're going to meet. Out of, let's say, a schedule of 20 students, you don't really know how many you'd be interested in.
Right. I remember when I was working at the firm, they were pretty explicit, even at the very top schools, about like, for people who are going to do on-campus interviews, like this is what we're looking for. And I think sometimes, at least at some of these top schools, people can be a little bit delusional because they're like, oh, well, I can just bid anywhere. And, like they have to talk to me. And like, I'm at Harvard, like, of course they're going to hire me, but that's not necessarily the reality, right?
Absolutely. And I've worked at a few different top firms that had different policies on which students you could call back. I worked at firms where there was a pretty strict cutoff of no matter how much you liked the student, if their grades didn't match up, they could not call them back, even if the interviewer really, really wanted to. And I worked at other firms where the interviewer could make a case for the student if their grades were borderline. And I think it's also important, even if you don't have extremely stellar grades, that you've excelled maybe in one or two classes. I think that says something. And also if there's sort of an upward trend of your grades, I think that helps.
Right. These are all ideal. So if someone's listening to this right before OCI, they can't really change your grades. What other things are firms looking for in summers? Like you said, you might really like the person. Like what exactly are you looking for outside of the kind of grades that we really can't alter at this point?
Well, I know that every firm I've been to had a different word for it. Someone called it a sparkle or, some factor that was kind of intangible. But I think it was basically that the interviewer enjoyed talking to the person and that they were passionate about something, had interesting things to say. I also think a key point is that you've expressed your interest in that particular firm. And whether or not you've had to do that for multiple firms, I think you need to be as excited about each firm and make the interviewer feel like you really want to work there.
Yeah, I think that makes a huge difference. I remember once I walked into an initial interview, and for whatever reason, I guess basically I bid on the wrong office of the firm, which I hadn't noticed. And so I'm, happily doing my standard spiel about why architecture, then law, then programming, blah, blah, blah. I've got my standard thing down. And then they say, why do you want to work in DC? And there's this pause. And I kind of said, DC. She said, yeah, you do realize you're interviewing with our DC office. And suffice it to say, I did not get a call back.
But, I've had students that get in those situations and somehow make the best of it and sort of roll with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I made a joke about it, but I was just
I've often had students come in and ask about offices we don't have, and things like that. And they're trying to get added in, and it's very obvious, that they're just doing this everywhere.
Or like practice areas that don't exist.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. They ask about practice areas that don't exist. I think that, sometimes you have to fake it till you make it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fine line, because the reality is, from the student perspective, a lot of these firms really are fungible, but each one of them wants to think that they are a unique unicorn of wonderfulness. And
I think we're at the law firm side, you're realistic that some of the things they're saying to you are just things they're saying to you. But if they sell it to you, then that means something.
Yeah, I mean, they're good lawyers at that point. If they can make you believe the crap they're spouting to every single firm about how special you are.
But I think that might be the top thing that I've seen that firms are looking for is, why us? Just to have some reason.
No, there needs to be a reason. And it needs to be, I mean, at a minimum, I think people, we'll talk about this in a second, but I think people need to have at least looked at the website. You need to have drilled down into what practice areas do and don't they have. You need to be prepared to talk about the practice areas you're interested in, why you're interested in them. You can't just be like, oh, well, you're in New York. It's like, okay, there are a lot of law firms in New York. Like, why do you want to work for us? Like, sell me on this. Make me feel special.
I had someone who had no connection to San Francisco at the time and was from New York and, needed to come up with a story. And their answer was that they felt that San Francisco was close in character to Brooklyn. Okay. And I just said, I don't think that's going to work.
Yeah, kind of.
You need to at least come up with a better story than that.
Yeah, make up a significant other or something.
Exactly.
All right, so we've talked a little bit about bidding and how to figure out what's the right perfect firm for you. Newsflash, there's probably not one that's perfect, but you can probably make lots of them work. So I've gotten my bid list. I've gotten my interview list, and some of the firms that I truly, really wanted are not on there. Is there anything I could do at this point?
Absolutely. I think you have a lot of control about that, and I think a lot of law students don't realize it. Okay. So the last firm I worked at, most of the summer class came from either people that I added onto my schedule when I was in the hospitality suite at OCI, or people that had written me as a recruiter ahead of time and asked to get added in.
Okay, so it's totally fine to send an find out who the recruiter is, send an email and say, hey, I'd really love to talk to you guys when you're on campus next week.
Yep, and I think that I was surprised at how few of those kind of inquiries that I got. And I think students don't realize that they have control of it. So what I would do is make sure that you know who's going to be on campus, where their hospitality suite is, or contact the recruiter ahead of time of a firm you're really interested in, and explain why you're so interested, and send your materials. So send your resume and your transcript ahead of time so, they know who you are. But I think most of the time, if someone seemed really interested and contacted me ahead of time or came to the hospitality suite, I would try to add them on. And that might mean that the interviewer has to stay through lunch or stay late, but I never really had an interviewer complain about it, because most of those students end up being someone who, we like.
Yeah, particularly if they have great credentials or great reason they want to work at your particular place and they just happen to have not been on the schedule. It would be kind of silly to be like, oh no, sorry, the lottery didn't pick you, so we can't talk to you.
Exactly. And I think it goes above and beyond that you've reached out to them. So I think that's one area that students have a lot of control over.
All right. Well, that's good to know. I'm not sure whatever would have occurred to me to send an email to a recruiter being like, hey, I'd really like to work with you. I just was like, all right, well, these are the places I'm talking to. Apparently one of them is in DC. Wow. Did I really sign up for Wachtell? That's going to be weird. That was a really weird interview. If you go in and you tell the person, this is not the answer to give, but this is literally the answer I gave. And they say, oh, why do you want to work at Wachtell? And I'm sitting there thinking, how in the name of God did I end up in this Wachtell interview? I don't want to work at Wachtell. And literally I couldn't think of anything to say other than, to be perfectly honest with you, I don't think I do.
Well, I bet the interviewer appreciated that.
Well, then he's literally spent the next 25 minutes trying to convince me that I did want to work there and they weren't as bad as everyone thought they were. And he was a really good lawyer. So by the end, I was like, yeah, maybe he's right. I mean, 3,500 hours a year, like that's not worse than other places. And then you walk out and you're like, what? Sorry, what?
It's an interesting approach of the interviewer to try to, use it for good PR for the firm.
Well, I think he was obviously as surprised as anyone when this came out of my mouth. Yeah. So what not to say when you're asked why you want to work at a firm? All right, well, let's touch on that. All right, so now let's talk about a little bit about how to prepare for these initial interviews, because they are going to be kind of hard to keep apart. I mean, I remember doing like 8 or 10 of these a day for a couple of days. Some places spread it out, but some places it's really concentrated. So how should students prepare for these? And then let's talk about what they should wear and bring.
Well, I think preparing, like you said, they should definitely go to the firm website and figure out, just the basics. How big is it? What are its main practice areas?
Where are they located?
Where do they have offices? Exactly. Is there something recent in the news about the firm? I think anything like that, just so you can throw it in. It could be something small. I also think you should make sure to look up your interviewer. You might not know until right before. You might not even know till the day of. If your interviewer's later in the day, go up to the room and see whose bio is out there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember ever really knowing what I was getting into.
Yeah, I think interviewers really appreciate, though, if someone knows something about them.
No, I feel like for callbacks, like I would usually get a list, but for the first interviews, I feel like you just walk in the room and like you just got to roll with it.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a big part of it too, is kind of changing your approach depending on the person, or being able to think on your feet. In terms of what to wear and bring, I would always wear a suit. So always business attire.
Don't stray from that.
I was surprised at the random person that would wear something completely inappropriate. Really? I also would stick with really basic colors, black, dark blue, gray. I wouldn't try to, make it a fashion statement.
Yeah, I remember I had like a pretty conservative suit, but I just couldn't resist the temptation to throw in like a really loud, obnoxious Thomas Pink shirt.
Yeah.
I mean, I was just like, it's memorable. They'll be like, oh, that girl in like the crazy purple shirt. You remember her?
I would say stick with classic.
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend it as a strategy. But if it's your personality and you can't resist, you'll probably still get callbacks.
Yeah, I agree. But I would definitely make sure that you're wearing a suit. And if you have an issue where you don't have a suit, talk to your career services. You can borrow one. There are lots of options. In terms of what to bring, I would make sure that you have copies of your resume and transcript and writing samples and anything someone might ask for.
I think that's a great point. Yeah, because oftentimes the people doing these interviews, you want to think that they've slaved away, like reviewing your materials for hours beforehand. But reality is, like, they might have been handed them, as you're walking in the door, or they might have not even been handed them. I definitely had callbacks where I was like, I'm sorry, they never gave me a copy of any of your materials. Could I please have a resume?
Yeah. No, I think those things happen all the time. Also, maybe you have an updated resume and you just got on a journal or something's new. So you want to make sure that they have your most current one.
Right. All right. And what can people expect, both in terms of a setting? Like, is it usually one person, 2 people? Is it partners, associates? And what kind of questions are they going to be asking?
So I don't know if students know this, but a lot of on-campus interviewers are in hotels.
Yeah, it's super weird.
Often the setting is a hotel room, which can be awkward.
Super weird.
Yeah. And usually they try to either put the bed away.
Yeah, or they have a suite, but you can still see it. It's just creepy and weird.
And yeah, and there's times where it's not set up well and it's just awkward. So I think you have to go in knowing that it may be an awkward situation. And, just look past it. The firms that I worked at, we always just sent one person. I know that occasionally there will be 2. I have never seen 2 interviewers work out that well.
I feel like I did a lot with 2 people, and oftentimes it was just kind of like they were talking to each other, and I was kind of sitting there being like, hi, well, I guess this is going well since everyone's chit-chatting amongst themselves.
That's exactly what I've noticed, and that's why I, as a recruiter, wouldn't send 2 interviewers.
It's a little weird. It can be a weird dynamic.
I just don't think it works out that well. Usually, it's going to be either a partner or a senior associate, someone with more experience.
And oftentimes firms will try to pick someone who went to that school too, right?
Correct. You try to find someone who has a connection. So an alumni, or someone who's been involved in events on that campus or knows something about it. As a recruiter, sometimes you're just sending whoever's available.
Yeah. Right.
Or there's last minute changes. So I think you could expect that most people are experienced interviewers, but they're not always. So sometimes you, as the person being interviewed, needs to kind of be involved and have it, be involved in having it go well also.
Oh, I think that's totally true. I mean, I think, one of the reasons I got a lot of callbacks was because I'm a pretty good interviewer. And part of that is literally just rolling with whatever situation is presenting itself. Like you might have someone, God, I did some weird interviews, particularly with callbacks. You're just like, because they're all different. You're in someone's space and you walk in their office and they all have these totally different energies. I remember this one guy, this appellate lawyer in San Francisco who was like really into yoga, and like his whole office, he was basically like meditating when I arrived and the lights are low. But we spent the whole time talking about yoga. And it was fine. And you get somebody else who's like totally frenetic and like really high energy. And part of it is you have to sort of adapt to that. And, I think doing some practice can be great. And also, there are probably certain things on everyone's resume that you can sort of guess people are going to be interested in. And you need to have a story ready for that. You can't just be like, my resume is really weird. And I literally told the same story about why it wasn't so weird and why it was really good for me being a law firm associate to probably 100 people in this process. And they all were like, okay, great. Or one bad grade, something like that. Like Lee has a story about doing really horribly her first semester in legal writing. And of course, they always talk to her about it. And she's like, well, look at the next semester. I got the highest grade in the class. All right, moving on. So whatever it is that's weird or problematic about your resume, I think you've got to be prepared to talk about confidently.
Yeah, I think those things definitely stand out. I remember the student that we interviewed who the interviewer asked them about, I can't remember if it was a club or some kind of activity they had been in. And the student said, I don't know what you're talking about. And it was on their resume. And that was just a horrible moment. So you should make sure that there is nothing on your resume that you don't expect to be asked about.
Oh, for sure. I remember doing an interview once in a callback and the guy was really hard to talk to. We had nothing going on. It was just like I'm dragging to fill 20 minutes or whatever I had with him. And so I'm like casting about for things to talk to him about. And I looked down at his interest section, which you should always have for this reason. And was like, oh, I see you're into cooking. Like, what do you like to cook? Can there be a more softball question than that? And he goes, oh, well, I guess it's something I'm interested in learning about. I like to watch cooking shows. And I was like, dude, just make something up.
Yeah.
Like, I don't care. Just give me something.
Yeah, I like to bake. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm like, it doesn't matter. No one cares what your answer is. You just can't put something on your resume like that and not have an answer.
Well, and I think actually that's a key point with interviews is it doesn't necessarily matter what the substance of what you're saying is. It matters a lot about how you're saying it and how you're able to answer questions.
Oh, yeah. I remember going to I was in a clerkship interview and the clerks were interviewing me and one of them was being like super aggressive and starts drilling me on the exact content of my undergraduate honors thesis. At which point I basically started making stuff up because I'm like, they're not going to know the difference. I don't remember this. They're not going to go to the library at Chapel Hill and pull this out and find out the answer. Like, you just have to go with it.
Exactly. I think it's just, and I think that's probably one of the characteristics of being a good lawyer.
Right. And particularly litigators. Like litigators will definitely go after you really just for sport in an interview.
Oh, absolutely.
If they sense weakness.
At one of the firms, actually it was the head of the office. He really took this as his own sport of he went through his stats of how many people he called back and how many people got offers and how many people came.
Oh, yeah, and it was really people, just the spreadsheet guys.
it was just like, what kind of good job did he do, as an interviewer?
Yeah, and I mean, let's face it, some of these people are lawyers, like they maybe shouldn't be talking to strangers. You're gonna encounter some weird stuff, and I think the rule of thumb is just make the best of it, keep calm, go with it.
I agree.
All right, so let's talk briefly about callback. So the process is basically you've done these initial interviews, hopefully they went well, you rolled with the punches. Now the firm is like, okay, great, we would love to talk to you. We want you to come back to our office, usually for half a day plus some sort of meal. So how does this work? And particularly if people have to interview in a different city, like do they have to pay their own airfare or what goes on here?
So this is a very set process that is governed by NALP, which is an organization that kind of oversees this whole process. So there is actually a set form that the firm you're getting called back to will probably give to you, or you can find at the NALP website. And you fill it out and you say who you're interviewing with, and then the firm splits the costs between wherever you're going.
So if you're going to interview with like 3 firms in one city, it's not the first one that invites you doesn't have to pay for everything.
Exactly. Now the person who invites you first will probably say, do you want us to be your host firm? And that's just the firm that kind of controls the process. So you might as well say yes to the first one.
Like, are they going to book your hotel or,
Exactly.
Okay.
So they're probably going to, take care of all the logistics. I would say that it's not required, but it's in good faith to book things, for one trip to the same city. I wouldn't take advantage of the process if you're a student. So, you have some events that you want to be there for. That's not really how this should work.
Right. And probably
you should try to group them in as few trips as possible. And you probably don't want to be flying around the country, for a month or two.
Well, do I get to fly business class?
Probably not. As a recruiter, I looked at things like that. And it's very specific, what your meal allowance is. I've had a lot of people try to put things through. And just give you the credit card receipt and not the itemized.
Not the mini bar. I mean, I remember one where I was in San Francisco and a friend of mine came over and like he wasn't really thinking and he like took some stuff from the mini bar and mixed himself a few drinks before we went out to a concert or something. And I remember being like the day I'm checking out, like, oh wait, I need 2 separate bills for this. I can't submit something with a mini bar bill on it. Like that's just not acceptable. And I can't mark it out because that looks really suspicious. Like you're watching porn, you need to think about what you're doing in these little things.
Did look at things like, did they order a movie and try to charge it to us for $19.99 or something?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is one of those scenarios where it's just going to pay to be conservative.
Absolutely. Well, and I think all of this stuff you want to make sure that everyone feels like you're doing things on the up and up, you're not going to be a problem, because I think all of these things to law firms can be a sign that you're going to be a problem later.
Right. And this is like one of the
as easy as possible.
Yeah, that's one of the key things they're looking for, right? Like you do not want to hire a problem child.
Absolutely. And when I look back at the people who turned out to be those people, usually there was a sign of it very early on in the process.
Yeah.
So I think what you want to do is stand out as being someone interesting and passionate and smart, but you don't want to stand out as someone who's, asking a lot of the firm.
Right.
At a time you shouldn't be.
Yeah, and I think this comes down to simple things like, don't complain about a layover if you have to take a layover. I mean, sure, if it's like 12 hours, fine. You can be like, hey, can you do something else? But at some point, this is time for like the 2-putt. You're just like, you nod, you smile, like that flight seems great. That hotel seems great. Loved the lunch we went to,
Exactly. I had a local law student once try to book travel from another city and have me pay for it. And I had to look back because she went to a law school that was about 30 minutes away. And she just said, and when I called her, I said, I assume this is a mistake. And she said, oh, no, well, I'm going to be somewhere else for a wedding. I just assumed you would fly me back.
What?
And it was hard to even book her call back after that because that was not a good sign.
Yeah, you don't want to be that person.
Exactly.
No, I mean, the firms are basically looking for someone who seems competent, responsible, not going to take advantage of things, and easy to work with, a person you could put in front of a client. if you're not going to be that person, probably not going to go well. All right. So give us a basic, what happens at a callback? I show up, like what time, what happens?
So at the firms I've worked at, we've either done callbacks in the morning or the afternoon. The morning callbacks usually, start around 10. You see, let's say 3 or 4 attorneys, and then you go to lunch and you leave after lunch. We always thought lunch was a really important part of it. So we would kind of lean towards having morning interviews as much as possible, because I think you do find out more about candidates during lunch a lot of times than you do in the formal interviews.
So what kind of things might you find out?
Exactly. Something to keep in mind is that a lot of times the lunch are with junior associates. So maybe like a first or second year, and there'll usually be 2 of them with you. And I think it's a chance to sort of open up. Something to keep in mind is that you're still on an interview. So even when you're at lunch, don't let your guard down too much. I think it's a time to be a little more relaxed, but you don't want to say things you wouldn't say, to the last person who interviewed you.
Right. Because these people are going to be submitting a report on you, basically, too.
Exactly. And I think, because potentially they're closer in age to you, I've had people say they're not really interested in the firm.
Nice.
I've had weird things like people, take off their shoes.
Okay. What about drinking?
I would never drink at an interview lunch.
What if everyone else is?
Do not do it. Even if first of all, the interviewer should not be drinking at the interview lunch, and I would review every receipt to make sure there wasn't alcohol on it or the person would get in trouble. I did have an interview once where the candidate ordered drinks, no one else did.
Awkward.
And the person we really liked, but they didn't get an offer because it was just such a bad sign. There's just no reason to drink at an interview lunch. I think a summer associate lunch, when you're working there, even that's kind of questionable, but a little more understandable.
Yeah, well, then you're not going to get fired on the spot for it, but it might raise some eyebrows.
So another thing to keep in mind at interview lunch is order something that's easy to eat.
Yeah, and not the most expensive.
Messy. Exactly. Do middle of the road. I would say follow what the interviewers are doing. So if they order appetizers and entrees, you can do that too. But I wouldn't order something like where you have to use your hands a lot. Like we had someone order chicken wings once, and the whole review of the lunch was all talking about what a mess this candidate was. So just order a sandwich is good. Even salads, I think, can be hard to eat.
What about what if someone has like dietary preferences or restrictions? Should they mention those beforehand?
Yeah, so a good recruiter should ask you those questions and should ask you if you have dietary restrictions or practice group interests or things, you're looking for, because they try to make good matches. But if they don't ask you and it's something that's strict, I would tell them. I would say if it's something like, I don't eat tomatoes, there's really nothing to say.
Right, but if somebody like keeps kosher or they're vegetarian... Exactly. I mean, maybe vegan meat, I guess gluten-free counts these days. I don't know.
So I would say, give them the best chance to make it go well.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how a schedule will work. You'll meet with the recruiter probably either before or after or both. I think you should remember that whoever you're talking to, you're in the interview. Mm-hmm. So if you're talking to the receptionist, if you're talking to a secretary, if you're talking to the recruiter, all of them can give feedback on you.
Right.
So you want to be polite and, not weird.
Yeah, don't make a bad impression. And do you think people should send thank you notes either after initial interviews or after callbacks?
So this is a very controversial topic.
Well, tell us.
I personally think no.
Okay.
And I know other people would disagree with me. And my last hiring partner, disagreed with me on this. I feel like there's a big chance to mess it up in a thank you note. And I've seen that happen more times than I've seen it do anything positive. Mm. So I would say if you really want to send one, I would keep it short. I would proofread it many, many times and have someone else look at it. Because the last thing you want is a typo in a thank you note, in an email or, paper note.
Right. So if we are going to send them, do you think email or paper?
I think email.
Yeah, I agree.
Because I think paper just gets thrown away. And I would probably mention one specific thing about that experience with that interviewer, and just make sure that it's accurate and you're not confusing them with someone else.
Yeah, those were the only ones that I ever found made any, I mean, not even that they necessarily moved the needle, but maybe they moved it a little bit. If somebody wrote me, an email or even like a note that they clearly had mailed that morning, that day, and said, hey, I really enjoyed meeting with you. Thanks so much for taking the time. I enjoyed hearing more about this case that we talked about. Thanks a lot.
I agree. I think maybe I take back not sending them at all, but only send them in cases where you feel like you had a very strong connection with the person.
Yeah, I don't think they're necessary, and I agree with you. I don't think they're necessarily going to move the needle that much. But as you say, if you screw it up, they'll move it the wrong direction. All right. So finally, we're running out of time, but let's wrap up with a few questions that we get a lot. Is it a disadvantage, and to what extent is it a disadvantage to interview in cities where you don't really have strong connections or your law school is not located? And what can people do about that?
I think it's tough, but I think that if there's a very specific reason that you want to be in another location, that it's absolutely something that you can do. I think the key is to make sure you have a solid story.
Right.
So like I said before, the story can be, I think San Francisco is very similar to Brooklyn, and I really like Brooklyn.
Yeah, I think I had someone tell me that, like, I just feel like San Francisco is kind of like my spirit city.
Yeah.
And I'm
a
like,
lot of people
try
so
again.
what I would say is, I wouldn't lie, but I would say that you can really focus on some connection that you have and maybe make it stronger than it actually is.
Right.
Like you said, I think it could be family, a significant other. I think it could be an experience you had in that place. So I think law firms definitely want to know why you want to be there. So just make sure that your story is solid. If you're looking at somewhere where you've never lived and there's no obvious reason.
Yeah, and I mean, in that case, I think you just have to play up what's unique about that city. So, if somebody came to me and they're like, well, I really want to work in San Francisco because I'm very interested in like the Silicon Valley ecosystem. I interned in law school for blah, blah, blah. Like I took this class on startups, whatever. Like you can sell that.
Absolutely. I think the thing with law firms is they don't want to take a risk on someone who doesn't really want to be there.
Right.
On the other hand, I think that law students want to find their real job during their summer associate position. So they probably wouldn't take a position somewhere where they didn't want to end up.
Right, in some cities it's less of an issue. I mean, if you are interviewing in New York, nobody really cares. They just assume you want to be in New York. It's really outside of New York, I think, that you've got to...
And I think the West Coast especially has had bad experiences with people who end up not wanting to be there or try to transfer to another office. And, I think they have smaller summer classes and they feel like it was a waste.
Yeah, I ran into that even when I'd lived in San Francisco for years beforehand. And then I went to law school in New York and I came back and was interviewing with a San Francisco firm and they didn't give me an offer, and I had some, interior scoop. So somebody told me why, and they're like, oh, well, basically because you're in New York, and we didn't think you really wanted to come back to San Francisco yet. And I was like, wow, okay, well, I think that was actually a lunch screw up too, because I think I was a little too honest at lunch. But yeah, live and learn. All right.
I told you the lunches will get you every time.
No, they did, because you're just chatting away and they're like, well, and I was like, well, I don't know. I haven't really decided. I'm like interviewing both in New York and in San Francisco. Like I really like San Francisco, but I really like New York. Like that's not what I should have been saying.
Right. Well, like you said, you live, you learn.
Yeah, exactly. I was trying to be honest, but maybe honesty is not the best policy. All right. Speaking of, what kind of questions are and are not appropriate to ask in these interviews?
So I would say it kind of depends on the firm, but my general advice would be I would stick with pretty substantive questions about the work in that particular firm. I would probably stay away from too much about work-life balance.
For sure.
I think you can ask about pro bono, especially if the firm, it's a really big deal to them, but I wouldn't make it too much of a focus in the interview.
I think that's right.
Ultimately, these firms are for-profit companies, and that's not necessarily like the main goal. And a lot of law students, I think, talk about it because they think it's like something interesting to talk about. but you don't want the firm leaving with the impression that that's the reason you're coming.
Yeah, I once asked someone in New York, like, oh, well, could you talk about the pro bono practice? I was basically just killing time. And he's like, well, to be perfectly honest, if that's something you're really interested in, you should probably go somewhere else. Wow. I was like, okay.
I think that's, that's probably more honest than a lot of
I was like, fair enough. Oh, you wouldn't believe it. I mean, I had some crazy interviews. I think one of my favorite questions, if you're running out of stuff to talk about and you need to kill some time, is always just, hey, particularly for associates, what kind of stuff are you working on? Could you give me a sense of like what your average day looks like?
That's what I was going to say.
They can talk
with junior associates. I think that's great because it's a real question, and it's something like you're going to know, that's going to be what you're doing later. So you want to hear about what they really have to say.
Well, and also people like talking about themselves.
Absolutely. I would say think of a few of those questions that you always have prepared, because I also think it's pretty bad if someone says, do you have any questions? And you just say no.
Right. Or you have one and the interview still has 10 more minutes to go. It's like you need to have some stuff. You need to be able to have a conversation, basically.
I think you need at least 5 in your pocket just in case.
Yeah, because you never know. I mean, you might encounter that person who has just nothing to say as an interviewer, and you're going to have to carry the ball telling some stories, asking some questions for basically the entire half hour.
Absolutely. And I think that, says a lot about you that you can do that.
Yeah.
I would say that some of those more fluffy questions you can ask once you have an offer.
Yeah, I don't feel like you should ever go, don't talk at lunch about, well, how many hours are you billing? What you can do in this situation is once you have the offer, it's very acceptable basically to go back and do another round or do another interview or another lunch, and then you can ask those questions.
Absolutely. I think that, you just want to get the offer.
Exactly. Your eye on the ball here, eye on the prize. Get the offer and then decide. In fact, that was actually my final question to you. So what factors should students consider when they're selecting an offer, assuming that you have several to choose from?
So my number one is always the people. Mm-hmm. Because I do think that law firms, especially sort of in big law, are very similar. So they might have slightly different cultures, they're in different cities or different sizes, but ultimately you're going to be doing probably good work, you're going to be working a lot, so you want to feel like you fit in with the people at the firm.
Yeah, I think you have to be a little careful here because obviously they're kind of trotting out their most personable people to do these interviews.
And that's why I would do, like you said, a follow-up visit.
Mm. And if you're out of the country, if you're in a different side of the country, like maybe you do a couple of phone interviews. It doesn't have to be that you fly back across the country for lunch. Right.
I agree. And I think because you want a big enough sample size that you feel like they didn't just give you like their 4 normal people.
Right. And also always be careful if you're like, oh, I'm a non-traditional law student and they give me the new mother. Like, this is not an accident.
Yes. And I would never try to do something that obvious, but I'm sure a lot of people would. So I think that's really important. I think I wouldn't make an offer based on, AmLaw rankings. Mm-hmm. I remember a summer associate that we had really tried to recruit hard and went somewhere else that I knew the person would not be happy at. It was completely not their personality.
Right.
And they kind of wanted to be the cooler guy and not the nerdy guy and picked that law firm. And then at the end of the summer called me and said, are you looking at 3Ls?
And you're like, I'm so shocked to hear from you.
I just said, I'm really sorry, but, we picked our summer class and, that's going to be our incoming class.
Right.
And the thing is, he had told me at the time before that this other firm was ranked 5 spots higher.
Right.
So I would never make a decision based on that. I think that, if it's in the same range, it's probably fine.
They're all basically the same.
Yeah. So I think you want to look at the people. I think you want to look at what practice areas you're interested in. I think you want to, get the feeling that people are busy, that the firm's doing well.
Right.
All of those kind of things. But I think just going back and getting to know people better usually solidifies your decision.
Yeah, I think that's true. And also, in terms of practice areas, sure, a lot of firms do everything, but are they really known for the area? I mean, one of the firms I summered at, they were really known as a corporate firm and I wanted to do litigation and they kind of sold me really hard on this idea. They're like, no, we're really litigation too. And I got there and you find out that's not really true. So, you kind of have to be a little skeptical of the line that you're getting in some of these interviews and just really do your due diligence. I mean, you're going to be a lawyer. You should be capable of doing some due diligence and kind of finding out what the reality is like at these places.
And I think the number one, the people that you really should talk to are former summer associates or people that you're like who are a year older than you, because they're going to tell you the truth. So that's what I would say. Yeah,
I think that's fair. Or even like young alums from your school might be more likely, if you go for coffee, they might be a little more likely. I mean, they may also lie to you. But you just have to accept there are a lot of people probably shading the truth, at least here.
I think most people will give you, some good, some bad, but I wouldn't rely on things like surveys, there's summer associate surveys, mid-level surveys.
Oh yeah. Well, this one got a 4.7 and this one got a 4.8. So obviously I should go to the 4.8. It's like, really?
Yeah. It's a ridiculous curve. Those surveys. I would also just say on a final note that if you have a bunch of offers and you know that there are firms you don't want to be at, I would say no to them early because you're taking something away from your classmates. Right. Maybe they're waiting to make more offers. So I would say maybe you do need extra time and you're trying to figure it out, but I would be as honest as possible.
Yeah, I mean, if you're holding 6 offers, come on, you're not really seriously considering all 6 of these. Like, get it down to the 2 or 3 you're most serious about and let somebody else have that spot who actually wants it.
Well, and I think people remember even students that they've made offers 2 years ago, and you never know when it's going to come back around and maybe you end up at that firm later. So I think you just always want to make sure you never did anything that left anyone with like a bad taste in their mouth.
Absolutely. I think that's the goal of this entire process. Don't make yourself memorable for bad reasons.
Exactly.
All right. Well, unfortunately with that, we are out of time. Hopefully this has been helpful. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on iTunes or your favorite listening app, because we would really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Allison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening. We'll talk soon, and good luck at OCI.